Schools are supposed to be safe. A place for laughter, lessons, and memories. But what if behind those classroom doors, something else was waiting? Tonight, we dive into 4 terrifying true stories from schools that hold more than just history. They hold secrets, whispers, and shadows that never left. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and listen closely. Because some students never really left the build. I still remember the bell that night, a dry, final ring that cut off the chatter in my skull. I was working late in the school library, stacking returned books and humming the tune that lives in my head when I'm nervous. The building had the strange, thin quiet that schools develop after the day's bodies and voices leave. It felt like an empty animal, folding itself around the shelves. I was the last student left on campus. The custodian had already locked the outer doors and would not be back for another hour. As I rounded the poetry stack, arranging paperbacks by the soft rules of a nervous ritual, I found a book that had not been there an hour before, a hardback, ink dark as a bruise, its spine unmarked and its cover blank. It lay on the top of a pile I could have sworn I'd finished. The book was warm, oddly warm from a place unread by sunlight. I opened it and the pages were filled with a neat, looping handwriting, dense and slanted. The lines smelled faintly of chalk and old erasers. At the bottom of the first page, written in careful letters, was a name I had not heard since grade school, my own name. I laughed at the thought, a quick, sharp thing, because coincidence is the safe comedy people fall back on. But someone had written my name as if they wanted me to find it. The hair at the back of my neck lifted like static. I flipped forward and the dates on the margins were recent, the ink still moist at the edges, as if someone had been writing an hour or 2 before. The entries read like diary notes, small observations about the library, about the lamps, about the way a mouse chewed at a baseboard. I looked up without thinking and felt my stomach clench. The clock over the circulation desk read 2:59. The library heater clicked twice, a small mechanical cough. I set the book down, my hands careful and deliberate like someone handling a fragile animal, and went to check the doors because the entry had begun to feel like a map. When I crossed the threshold into the front hallway, the fluorescent lights were buzzing. The corridor's length changed when I moved through it, as if the walls had a slight flinch. My breath felt large in the thin corridor air and the posters on the walls, old club flyers. A torn cheerleading photo seemed to watch me pass. I ran back to the library and the book lay open again to a new page, a paragraph about someone who was returning and would smell of rain. I had the absurd, compounding thought that the book itself was updating, a living log that wanted me to read along. The hair on my arms prickled and the chairs seemed suddenly too small for safety. I decided to leave through the staff door near the back entrance, but when I turned the handle it was locked from the outside. The custodian's keys were on the desk where he'd left them that afternoon. Panic lives in small, sharp decisions. I fetched the school phone and dialed the district office. Someone at the other end answered and said they had no record of the custodian. He takes the early route on Thursdays, the voice said slowly, but no one should be on campus late tonight unless you reported it. I reported myself and my voice sounded thin through the receiver. While I was on the line, a whisper of movement grazed the top shelf behind me and a single paper clip fell to the floor with the sort of metallic, surprised sound a thing makes when it discovers it has been noticed. I waited in the library, the book face up and its ink forming sentences that edged right to left like a tide. The police arrived with flashlights and polite, tired faces. They searched the campus, and in the old choir loft they found the custodian asleep, curled like a child on a folding chair. He claimed to have been there the whole time. In his pocket was the same blank book, the cover unwritten, its pages empty as if ink had been waiting in the air. Later, at home, I found an entry in my own handwriting describing the night, a sentence that ended with the words "Do not sleep near the window." I had no memory of writing it. I remember the exact smell of the place at that hour, a mixture of dust and paper and a cleaner's lemon that had been diluted too many times. My hands kept moving, placing books like a ritual of order when everything else felt unruly. The lamplight made halos on the wood floor, and each halo seemed to shiver when a car passed outside, a small earthquake of light. Time became elastic after I found the book. Moments stretched into long threads where I could see small things in exaggerated clarity, an ink blot on a margin, the tremor of a page's edge, the the tiny scuff on the bottom of a chair whose owner had been a teacher years ago. I tried to anchor myself with movement, walk to the circulation desk, wipe a table, check a shelf. Movement felt like a promise to return. The book's handwriting shifted in tone, at times clinical, like a report, other times intimate, like someone whispering a memory to a friend. There was a line that read, "He does not like the backlight," and I realized it was referring to me. The idea that an object could single me out felt childish and enormous at once. When the officers asked to see the book, the pages were blank where they had been full minutes before. An empty notebook is a worse sort of evidence because it leaves you accused of hallucination. For a long time afterward I avoided libraries at night, and if I ever walked past the school after dark I kept my steps quick and my head down. The memory replayed itself like a scene in a bad dream. I would wake and then find I was walking the hallway again in my head. Once I tried to trace the route I had taken that night on a paper map, measuring steps and estimating time, as if precision could stitch the event back into a tidy seam. Precision failed, and the map looked small and pitiful on the table as if it were not the world but a child's drawing. There was a rumor among seniors about a student who used to slip notes into library books. They called him the noteman in jokes, as if an old habit could be criminal or quaint. Now the rumor had new teeth. I thought about the students who occupied those stacks years before me, their anxieties, their small domestic dramas, and imagined a continuity where small acts of attention were recorded and later returned as messages. I was on detention from a foolish choice, a prank gone wrong in the chemistry lab, and I sat at the back of room 214, elbows on the desk, a blue pen leaking a small puddle on my worksheet. The teacher left last, the lights dimmed into a sleep-ready hum, and the only sound came from the radiator and the distant traffic. I heard footsteps that were not the pad of shoes but the sound of soles shuffled like old paper. A shadow slipped across the wall behind the projector screen. The hall outside the classroom was empty according to the clock and the soft hum of the building. Then came a knock so light I thought it might be the weather tapping the windows. I stood and went to the door, hand on the handle, and peered down the corridor. A girl in a uniform too small for the decade stood there, her face pale as if she had been washed in milk. She held a book against her chest and her eyes were too large for her face, dark and patient. She did not seem to blink. I asked if she needed help and she said, in a voice that was both far away and intimately near, "Can you carry this for me? My locker is broken." I should have said no. I should have told her to speak with the office or call the number at the front desk. Instead, I did something softer because I thought I recognized the manner in her tone. I took the book and followed her down the hallway. The school at night is a geography of doors that close the world out. We walked through a section where the floor tiles had been polished to a silence. The girl led me to a locker that had no lock in the modern sense, only an older metal strip where a padlock must once have hung. She lifted the flap and reached inside. For a moment I thought she might cry. She handed me a folded photograph of a group of smiling faces. When I looked I saw the picture had been taken at a picnic decades ago and the faces wore fashions from another life. The girl watched me as if she expected me to understand. I checked the security footage later with the principal. The timestamp on the footage showed me walking by the locker at 3:04 a.m., but the calendar registered the date as 3 years prior. The girl's image on the tape flickered like a faulty bulb, then resolved into a still frame of a student who had vanished the winter of that year. She'd been reported missing, and though searches had been made she had never been found. The file on her was thin and exhaustion-shaped. The principal did not look at me directly when he said the girl's name. The corridor seemed to fold as I walked it after that night. Where once there had been long lines of lockers, I started seeing small pockets of shadow that felt like memory tucked into corners. The janitor, when I confided in him, tapped the side of his nose and said, "If something asks for a favor in the dark, sometimes it wants you to carry it where it cannot walk." I liked him for saying that and mad at him for the way his eyes had gone soft on the edges. I remember the hallway light as a thin ribbon and the sound of the girl's shoes scraping the tile. Later, in a dull, defensive conversation with friends, I found myself insisting that I had done what any decent person might do. They nodded with a politeness that tried to be the medicine for strange things. Sometimes moral clarity is a poor shield. The footage, the photograph, and the locker all became parts of a story you tell in half-voice at parties when you have had more wine than you should. The memory repeated itself. In dreams the girl's uniform changed to a different decade and the hall became lined with faces I did not know. I started to notice the small things in the corridor during the day. A scuff on a locker, a ribbon caught in a lock, a smear of old gum removed poorly. Those things are anchors if you let them be. Sometimes anchors are all you have. The auditorium felt like a place that had learned to keep secrets. I used to stay after drama club, practicing lines into the velvet like someone telling prayers. One night, as I lingered on stage practicing a monologue, I heard the small scratch of paper at the edge of a step. There sat a paper crane, folded from catalogue paper, with a tiny stone inside its hollow. A note tucked in its wing read, "We will watch your show." It should have been a small mise-en scene for a theatre kid to love. Instead it sat heavy in my pocket like a small thing of consequence. I pocketed the crane and walked to the back of the stage. The catwalk ladder, always chained, hung open by a hair of slack chain. No one was supposed to be up there, ever. The house lights hummed in a long, low sustain, and when I looked up a child's shadow moved on the catwalk though no child was visible. The shadow's gait was wrong. It folded at the hip in a way that suggested leaning heavier at the knees. A soft humming came down from above, a lullaby out of joint. I felt a finger of cold in the place where a warm theatre glow usually lives for actors. The next week, during a small rehearsal, a call came for volunteers to help with an after-school cleanup. I volunteered on impulse and the director sent me to the booth to test props. Inside the booth, taped behind a stack of cue cards, I found more cranes, dozens each one with a pebble and a slip of paper. Remember the light, remember the play, do not forget the names. It read like a litany for a cast of ghosts. That evening the lights failed for 20 seconds mid-performance and when they returned the audience's breath resumed the room as if nothing had happened, but the relief was brittle. Actors are superstitious by habit and work. We keep talismans to feel less alone under the lights. I kept one crane in my jacket for months, its pebble a reassuring weight. The crane warmed slightly when I held it, as if body heat communicated with memory. I thought often of the children whose drawings sometimes appeared tucked in the wings, drawings that were smudged and perfectly preserved at once. After that night, the theatre felt like a place with an address in the past. When you pass the lobby you might think you hear the echo of clapping that is not quite applause, a residue of other hands and remembered lines. The city maintenance man told me that during a renovation they had found a stack of playbills from a decade before, and inside the program someone had written names in pencil, multiple times, as if practicing signature. Those repeated names seemed to press themselves into the fabric of the venue. When the catwalk lights stuttered once more months later, I felt the same old small hollow of fear and gratitude that comes from having something acknowledged. People called it superstition and I called it attention. The cranes continued to appear now and then, a private ritual left by strangers or friends who had reasons to believe the stage listened. I do not go alone to the theatre at night anymore. It is a rule I made quietly and have kept. The computer lab is a blue-lit room where monitors throw the faces of users into a quiet, cold intimacy. I was there late, typing an essay for a class I did not much care for, when a chat window opened on the screen across from me. I thought someone was pranking the lab and typed, "Who's there?" The response came slow and deliberate, "Do you remember the sound of the bell?" I typed back a question and the reply was a string of words that gradually made no sense and then bunched into clarity, "Meet me at the lockers." The chain still remembers. I went, because I am not braver than hesitation. The corridor with the peeling paint smelled like rain and old glue. At the locker, someone had placed a child's pink scarf and a note rolled into a tube. We followed the bell and lost our way. The tokens made my throat tight. The scarf had a faint smell of starch and apples. In the locker, someone had arranged a small row of eraser shavings as if to show a path. They were tiny and careful, the kind of marking a person uses when afraid to be noticed. I went back to the lab and the chat log had saved itself, messages time-stamped at 1:11 a.m., with a final entry that simply read, "Don't forget." When I reported it, the IT tech shrugged and said the logs had been scrubbed in an update. The security footage for that hour had a patch of fuzzy static in the corridor where the locker sat. The rest of the tape was clear as day. The janitor told us stories of a bell that the old school had once used, an iron thing, wound by hand, that had been moved during renovations. Sometimes the chain remembers, he said, and he tapped his desk as if to prove it. The idea of a bell remembering is silly in the way of superstitions. It is also the sort of story that seeds itself because we like to have shape for the things that frighten us. I kept a screenshot of the chat for a while on an old phone, though the metadata refused to give a date. The image blurred when I looked too long at it, and sometimes the words rearranged on the screen like a puzzle. When a friend comes over and asks about it, I make a joke and change the subject. Jokes are currency when you cannot find proof. At the lockers, the small footprints of sneakers were visible in condensation on the tile after a storm, as if someone had walked and then lifted as if being pulled up. I remember touching a locker lip and feeling the cold metal hum like an instrument. The corridor seemed full of histories, small acts collected into a shape that often feels more like a habit than a haunting.